Hi, I'm Wendy Luers, and I'm delighted. I'm delighted to see this many people coming and for these two wonderful men to tell you a great deal of wonderful stories. But first of all, I have to thank the Consul General, Arnos Kadesh, who is very kindly here and has lent us part of his staff and is allowing us to use this building, as are Teresa Proibna, who is the head of the Czech Center. Some of you have come through these different mailing things. Joseph Balash is in absentia in Nova Scotia, but he's the head of the BBLA and also on the board of the Vaclav Havel Center, and he also runs this building, so we're thanking him again. And really, most importantly, I want to thank Jana Krupkova from the Vaclav Havel Center. So give her a hand. She's a one-woman marvel, let me tell you. Diki. Now, we're so lucky to have, and I know that Stephen's going to introduce Bill in greater depth than this, and then it's not appropriate for the wife to be introducing my husband. But I would like to introduce, first of all, our wonderful friend and the president of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, who lived in Prague with the East-West Institute for 7 years. And we've had many adventures together in Prague and afterwards. So Stephen is going to be having a conversation with Bill.
Name where that center was.
Pardon me?
See if you can get the word out.
What, the Vaclav Havel Center or the East-West Center?
East-West Center.
No, it's no longer.
In
what?
Stiržín.
In Stiržín, which
Yeah.
everybody always told, all the Czechs told me that I mispronounced it, Stiržín. And they said, that's wrong. And I said, well, it's as good as I can do.
Yeah. Really hard.
So anyway, welcome to all of you. We're thrilled that you're here. And this is about Bill's memoir, about an extraordinary life that I've been happy enough to live with for 45 years. So take it away, Stephen.
Okay. Thank you, Wendy. Well, I want to add my thanks to all of the hosts and to all of you for being here. This is fantastic. And, it's hard to express what a great joy it is for me to have this conversation with Bill. We have been, along with Wendy and my wife, such dear friends for 35 years. Friends and colleagues and partners, and we've done so much together, sometimes just for fun, sometimes with great moment and purpose. But it's always been a learning experience for me, a joyous experience for me, and an enormous pleasure. So Bill, thank you for giving me the opportunity to have this conversation with you. And Wendy, thank you as always for your extraordinary energy. Wendy is like an individual nuclear reactor. We should be bottling whatever it is, but it is really remarkable. And I'm actually going to, after Bill says a few things that he wants to say at the beginning, I'm going to ask Bill to say a little bit about Wendy, because you can't really understand the story of Bill Luers without understanding the story of Wendy Luers and the story of Bill and Wendy Luers. I actually, many people, and Mark Zuckerberg himself claims that he invented the social network, but actually it was Wendy and Bill Luers who invented the social network. Just because probably one or two of you don't know Bill that well, I want to just quickly recap the extraordinary career of this wonderful man. And by the way, probably a number of us have read diplomatic and personal memoirs of various kinds. This is really an extraordinary book. It's not just, I did this, I did that, I was there when. It's an analytical book, it's a passionate book, it's a book that reveals the truth about what went on in the various times and the various places that Bill and Wendy were living and working to try to make the world a bit of a better place. So I really can't recommend it highly enough. But just to refresh everybody's memory, so Bill grew up in Springfield, Illinois, in the land of Lincoln. He went off to Hamilton College. He studied chemical engineering, thought he wanted to be a chemical engineer, and applied for graduate school in chemical engineering and went to Northwestern for a bit, realized he didn't want to be a chemical engineer, thought, from chemical engineering to being an Episcopal priest, that was the kind of shift in Bill's thinking at the time. But I think those two things tell you something about this man: an analytical capacity with a belief in the spirit, in the heart, in the beauty of things. He then went into the Navy. This was the Korean War, and it was a smart move, and he was stationed in Italy, where he later served in a diplomatic post. When he got out of the Navy, he studied Russian at Columbia University, Russian culture, Russian history, and Soviet affairs. And then in 1957, he decided to join the Foreign Service and spent more than 30 years serving our country as a Foreign Service officer and as an ambassador, first in Venezuela and later in Czechoslovakia. He also, of course, was president of the Metropolitan Museum of Art here in New York from 1986 to 1999. And I'm proud to say that he also served on the board of trustees of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the foundation that I lead, also for a very long time, for a decade in the late 1980s into the 1990s, and then onwards into the 2000s when I was hired to be the president. So I'm deeply grateful for Bill for not vetoing my appointment. And we worked together under that guise for quite a while. And more recently, Bill and I and some other extraordinary diplomats on a voluntary and informal basis have been leading the Iran project and guiding a very important Track 2 diplomatic initiative with Iran that we can get into a bit later. But I do want to say that tonight's discussion, I think we really should focus on the Czechoslovakia years. I mean, we are, after all, here in the Bohemian National Hall as guests of the Czech Center and the Vaclav Havel Center in New York. And that's where we first met in 1990 when I joined the East-West Institute after a 15-year career in state government and politics in Connecticut because I was so inspired by Václav Havel and what was happening in Eastern Europe. And that was the beginning of our friendship and our working relationship that has meant the world to me ever since. So, Bill, I'm going to pose some questions to you in a bit, but I think you have something you want to say at the very outset.
Yes, thank you, Stephen. You have been one of my closest friends ever since I've been back here, ever since you came to Czechoslovakia. And I'm honored that you agreed to do this. I want to talk a little bit, preempt you to talk a little bit about Wendy. Nothing in this book would have happened, would have been possible without her. As any of you know her, she has this energy which is maybe nuclear, I don't know. But she and I met in San Francisco.
It's definitely renewable, that's for sure.
She and I met in San Francisco when I was out speaking at the Hastings Law School on human rights in 1965.
1976.
76. And whenever, yeah. You just witnessed an example of my relationship with Wendy. So, and as Stephen just got through mentioning, I was born in Springfield, Illinois. You know, there's a Springfield in every state of the Union. And every Springfield is not as famous as Springfield, Ohio. And the presumed opportunity given by the people of Springfield, Ohio for immigrants to eat the illegal immigrants to eat the pets of the people from Springfield, Ohio. But Springfield, Illinois has its own group who follow Abraham Lincoln. And it's always been my thought that Springfield, Illinois is the best of the Springfields because of this Lincoln Association. And if anybody's ever been to Illinois and to the West Coast, to San Francisco, and San Diego, where Wendy started her life, you will know that Illinois is not anywhere near San Francisco. And broad, flat plains, you could drive for hours without seeing anything but corn. And when it was time for me to take Wendy back home to Springfield, she wasn't sure this is something she really needed to do. Even though my parents were there, still there. And so we arrived, and I drove Wendy out to see my mother's farm, which is in Pleasant Plains, that exciting town of Pleasant Plains. And so I drove Wendy out there, and she fell asleep on the way. And she slept most of the time we were traveling in the countryside. And when we went there for a formal presentation of Wendy to my schoolmates in Springfield, she found a treasure or a T-shirt which she enjoyed a lot, and it has a big picture of Lincoln on the front of it, and on the back it has, "They'd have to shoot me to get me back to Springfield." And that's been sort of our life theme ever since. So, and she is a California lady with the energy and the care that is characteristic of California people. And she's created more organizations than anybody I know, organizations that have continued to exist, several of which are sponsoring this event this evening. So nepotism is real and functioning well. But I can't help but look at the face of Vaclav Havel and think how far we've come since 1990. How far we've gone. How the world is not nearly like it was then, with the enthusiasm that all of us had for this particular human being who had combination of stardom and ideas that thrilled the world. When I took Vaclav through New York, and Wendy and I organized his trip here, and I went with him to every stop. He said, "Bill, why do I have to speak at every single place?" He said, "I'm a playwright, not a speaker. I don't write speeches. I don't know what to say to people. I have to think of something new every time. They expect something new from me. And I said, Vaclav, you have become the oracle of the end of the Cold War and the oracle of Prague. Live with it. Play the role and realize that you're expected to be wise on every occasion.
So you're getting a little bit ahead of me. I want to go back a little bit more to the beginning.
Okay.
To start really understanding your approach to diplomacy. And I want to just say as we start that part of the conversation, the great international relations theorist Hans Morgenthau in 1978 coined the expression strategic narcissism to describe diplomats and countries who could only see the world through their experience, their perceptions, their values, etc. It's like if you want to understand another human being, look at yourself in the mirror. And Bill, on the other hand, is an exemplar of a very rare form of diplomacy, which is strategic empathy. And I think that really has distinguished your career all the way through. But the question I want to start with is, what inspired you to go into the Foreign Service in the first place?
Well, you named it. I think the call I had to enter the church was part of it, which people hate to hear. But I think many scratch a diplomat and you'll find a lot of do-gooders who really believe that their mission is given to them. And I think the second was I just love travel, and my Navy career, which got me to Italy. I spent a total of 5 years living in Italy, and the inspiration I got from Italian food, travel, art, was critical to the chemistry that brought me together with a few of my colleagues I knew in Naples who were new Foreign Service officers. And so I think another aspect was my assumption that the Soviet Union was a problem for us, and I wanted to be in I wanted to play a role in that problem solving. So I started studying Russian already when I was in Italy.
And then, so then you came back and you went to Columbia and studied Russian seriously, and Russian culture and history and language. And then ultimately, you get posted to various places around the world, including Moscow, where you did remarkable things by bringing cultural leaders from the U.S. to meet with cultural figures in the Soviet Union. But after serving as ambassador to Venezuela, President Reagan appointed you ambassador to Czechoslovakia, and you and Wendy arrived in Czechoslovakia at the end of 1983. And this was at the height of the Cold War. I mean, these were really tense and dark days. As you remember, President Reagan came into office talking of the Soviet Union as the evil empire. He was moving quickly to station Pershing rockets in Western Europe. The Soviets were stationing SS-20 missiles in Western Soviet Union. So we had a standoff and an arms race building. It was a very tense time. And you arrived in Prague in 1983. What was it like? What was the atmosphere? What was the nature of the state that you were there to have relations with?
Well, when I arrived, I had to present my credentials to the president of the country, and I presented them to the then president of Czechoslovakia. Husak.
Yeah.
And Husak said to me, Ambassador, you've arrived on your post at the time of worst relations in the history of U.S.-Czechoslovak relations. And I said, that's saying a lot. Could this really be the worst time? He said, yeah, we're on the verge of the Third World War. They were convinced, they'd been told by the Soviets, that the Pershing missile placement in Europe would cause the war, the nuclear holocaust we'd all been worried about. And it was typical of the Czechs. They believed everything the Soviets said. And I found it difficult. And Husak was a difficult person. He was Slovak. And he was
That's not the reason he
not
was
because
difficult.
he was Slovak. Because my caretaker is Emilia Kazakova, who is a Slovak.
She forgives you. It's all right.
And one of my great friends, Slavka Glazer. Slavka, where are you? Slavka is one of my closest friends, who's also Slovak. They're both nice people. I can prove it. But the Husak was not a nice person, and he kept Havel in jail in prison for 4 years. And when Wendy and I arrived in 1983, here was Husak with Havel still in jail. And I remember one time, several years later, I'd protested the jailing of Havel many times during my years working with Czechoslovakia. And they threw him in jail again in the summer of 89.
86.
86.
89, sorry.
89. 89.
The score is now 1-1.
And Wendy and I had been to visit Havel along with a friend of ours, Lord Cutler, who was a lawyer, who later played a role in writing the Constitution of Free Czechoslovakia. And we were sitting with Havel, and I, as I was given to do, asked him how things were going. I said, what do you think about the student demonstrations in Prague? And they were getting quite serious at the time. Ultimately led to the Velvet Revolution, as you know. And Vaclav said, I don't think much of those demonstrations, because every time the demonstrations happen, they throw me in jail.
So you arrive in Prague in this very dark time, according to Husak, the worst period of relations between our two countries. And you decide that the way you're going to try to break through this period of impossible relationship is through culture.
Yeah.
And how did you come to that conclusion? I mean, what you and Wendy did almost immediately upon arriving in Prague was to use that beautiful Peček Palace, which is the embassy residence for the U.S. ambassador to Czechoslovakia, now the Czech Republic, to host these extraordinary gatherings of cultural figures, artists, musicians, rock stars, movie makers, magazine publishers, Amistad writers, and you would bring, their kind of counterparts from the U.S., just a who's who, Edward Albee, John Steinbeck, Kay Graham, the list goes on and on and on, to connect these intellectual and cultural leaders of this country that was under a dark, dark cloud and a lot of repression with people who could understand them, who they admired and were thrilled to meet. How did you decide to take that risk?
Well, the time in Venezuela had convinced me that having artists visit Venezuela opened the doors for diplomacy and made Venezuela feel important. And it was important in those days for Americans, none of whom had ever visited Latin America, to come to Venezuela and show that they were interested in Venezuela. And we had such a network by then of friends
Amazing.
Who were writers that we invited Kay Graham and Henry Grunwald, Updike, Styron, Cheever, Kurt Vonnegut, Peter Matheson, and many more to visit us in Prague.
So, and you had, as I remember from our conversations, you had two purposes in mind in doing this, and obviously correct me if I'm wrong, but one was to make these connections between cultural figures in the US and their counterparts in Czechoslovakia, in part to help provide protection for those cultural figures in
exactly.
a communist country who were being thrown in prison.
Right. Shine the light on
exactly. But you also had a strategic goal in mind.
Well, there were, at that time, Czechoslovakia was at the bottom of the Central European satellite countries in terms of U.S. policy, partially because '68 happened and the Soviets and the Czechoslovak government seemed to accept completely their role as toadies of Moscow. And they it was embarrassing that they were so obedient to the Soviet line. And when I went for my hearings before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Claiborne Pell was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and asked me, Bill, I knew Claiborne, and he was feel-good Pell. I was told he would repeat the phrase, I feel good about this, many times during my hearings. And the test of how many times he feels good about it is how you're doing. And I got about 4 feel-goods right at the very beginning. And he'd been a Foreign Service officer before he was in the Senate. And he'd been stationed in Bratislava as the consul Consulate General. And so he knew where Czechoslovakia was, and he knew this irony, this problem of the Czechoslovak sitting at the bottom of our pyramid of countries and how we dealt with them. And during the Cold War, the United States had a peculiar criteria for developing relations with the satellites. We had a belief that our policy has to be supporting all those satellites that were opposed to the Soviet Union. And at that point, there were several other countries ahead of us, ahead of U.S.-Soviet relations, U.S.-Czechoslovak relations. There was the Romanians had refused to participate in the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, and didn't participate in the occupation of Czechoslovakia. So they get a point.
And some loans, by the way.
So
They also got some loans.
And Ceausescu, the terrible Ceausescu, who was killed by his population, and who was clearly the worst of the...
Bill's mic seems to have gone off. Test it again now, Bill.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
East Germany had its mini revolution in 1954, and Poland was always Poland. It had a special relationship with the United States, and the Polish Pope didn't hurt. He played an enormous role in this period. So Czechoslovakia had nothing going for it because it had accepted so completely the Soviet occupation. And so I decided that not only would inviting all these prominent Americans to Prague and having them come would enable me to shine the light on, Wendy and me to shine the light on Havel and his group, Charter 77, but also be a source of pride for the people of Czechoslovakia with their tradition of literature. And everybody wanted to see Kafka. And one time when John Updike came, before he went to the airport, he asked me to drive him to the Kafka gravesite in the new Jewish cemetery in Prague. And I drove him on a Sunday, and myself, I was driver. And because the driver was off on Sunday, and we went to the graveyard where Havel was buried, and I went up to the door and I pushed the button, and a hand came to the window and said, "We're closed, we're closed." And I pushed again, and a guy came out and he was in white, clearly a sculptor. And I said, I'm the American ambassador and I want to see I went to the car, I waved my flag, and I said, I'm the American ambassador, I want to visit the tomb of Kafka. And in addition to being the American ambassador, I've got John Updike with me. And these two guys in white coveralls, who were obviously annoyed by my presence, said, "You've got John Updike." They screamed at me. And John, they came and took John in the door. They didn't take Wendy and me. We followed John. And so John went to see the tomb. And the interesting story about John is they wanted somebody to do the introduction to a book that was being published by a series of Kafka that was being published. And they came to John to do it because John was such a credible literary historian. And he wrote the introduction to this. And our friend, the Jewish writer from Warren.
From where?
Warren, Connecticut.
Francie Duplexis Gray?
No.
Philip Roth?
Philip Roth. Philip was thought to be at the time, because he was Jewish, the great authority on Kafka, and he was passed over by the book publishers. And John wrote a brilliant essay on Kafka. But the thing is, the Czech culture was so rich, and with a mixture of German, Czech, and Jewish, and it was
and even in a repressive society, laborers got hold of American literature and translation,
right.
And they knew it. So these guys, it's not a surprise to anybody who knew Czechoslovakia in those years that they knew John Updike. Yeah. It was one of the extraordinary things about it. So Bill, you were, engaging deeply with the cultural and dissident community in Czechoslovakia and bringing all these distinguished Americans. How did the Czech government react to this?
Well, as I say, there were two aspects to their. One is they were aware that I was trying to put the spotlight on Vaclav Havel and make it difficult for them to arrest him again.
Right.
And they also wanted to be moved up the ladder with regard to Eastern European satellites and how we dealt with them. And I figured the second was I could do it on the cheap. I could invite these leaders, literary and journalistic leaders and other prominent people, and make them feel like they were being recognized.
Yeah. And you got them to negotiate a bilateral agreement
Yeah.
under the Helsinki process, right?
Feel Good Pal, one of the things he said, do you think the Czechs would ever be allowed to sign a Helsinki agreement with the United States? And I said, I'll check it out. And so when I looked for a way to do it, I arrived in Prague and found out that the foreign minister was a Slovak, whose name was Bohuslav Knopek. And Knopek spoke English, was from a town near the town where Andy Warhol was born. And he obviously had a thing about the United States. And he told me in my first meeting with him, he said, look, I want you to begin shooting. No American ambassador's ever shot quail, has ever shot pheasants with us. And if you go buy yourself a Berno gun, I will teach you how to shoot. And I said, I'm not a shooter. And he convinced me to do it. He said, I will introduce you to every leader in our country that you won't see officially. You see them informally, which is the way you want to see them anyway. So he invited me to all their shoots, wild boar, deer, pheasant, rabbits, and
No Czechs or Slovaks, I hope.
no. And we were able to get to know each other very well.
It's such a smart strategy.
And I've just got to tell you this story. Where's my book?
Right. Your copy? What?
No, Andy.
I think he wants his copy of the book.
No, I want my copy of Andy Warhol.
Oh, Andy Warhol. Oh.
So, I'll tell you this, we'll get to it later, but when Vaclav Havel was being sworn in the castle as president, I'm standing under the balcony where he's talking, and a guy came up to me and punched me in the side, in the ribs, and said, I've got something for you.
Yeah.
And he had this book, Andy Warhol, which is a book that Bohuslav Knopek wrote on the life of Andy Warhol. And he said, maybe you'll promote it for me in the United States.
It's fantastic.
I didn't do that, but it was part of the connection.
Yeah. We are, we could do this for a very long time, but we're kind of running out of time. So I think we should do a series, by the way, because I think there's so much more to discuss. But before we take some questions from the audience, I have two things that I want to finish with. One is, so you came back, you and Wendy, from your service in Prague at the end of 1986 and took up the presidency at the Met. And of course, this was already when Mikhail Gorbachev was the first secretary of the Communist Party. And you later, not that far later, but you wrote an article in Foreign Affairs in 1990 in which you said that, we've seen all these peaceful revolutions in Central Europe and these extraordinary figures like Václav Havel and Lech Wałęsa, et cetera, but the person who was really the hero of that story, you said, was Mikhail Gorbachev.
Yeah.
And looking back on it now, how do you see him?
No question. He was different as a Soviet leader. Substantially different. And I'll tell you, this is a longer story than you want to hear. But I would religiously watch Soviet 6 o'clock television broadcast directly from Moscow to Prague. and to all Eastern European countries. It's where they got their word. And I would come home, and I would on my bicycle, pedaling away, and the television came live, and it was a party meeting in St. Petersburg, chaired by Gorbachev. And I'd never heard of Gorbachev before. I knew he was their new head, but I didn't know why. And he was speaking from the podium, and he was leaning on the podium informally, and he was calling on people in the audience to reply. I'd never seen like that in a Soviet meeting before. It was all so disciplined and routine. And so I found a way to get to the Czech Prime Minister. And I was not supposed to see him ever. And I ran into him. I literally designed my route to run into him physically at a big fair in Brno. And I came up to we ran into each other, and I told him I'm sorry. I wasn't sorry at all. I'd planned it that way. And I said, look, I want to ask you about this guy Gorbachev. And so he said, come see me whenever you want, which is not what I'd expected from him. So I came, I got a phone number that I could call, and he would send a car for me to pick me up from my car in a place not visibly near his office. So I went in to see him. I said, what's going on with this guy Gorbachev? Who is he? And he told me that he knew Gorbachev very well. And I knew that they all had to know Gorbachev well. They had to know the entire Politburo well. And I spoke to the Prime Minister in Russian because I didn't speak Czech that well. And I knew he would speak Russian, which he did very well. And so we conversed in Russian. And he told me how Gorbachev was designated by Andropov to be his successor. And Andropov had actually selected him to be the next Secretary General of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And he was of a different generation. He had not been in the Politburo long, and was bold. And the Czech Prime Minister agreed with that proposition. And he said,
sorry.
And I sent that message back to Moscow, back to Washington, about how the Czech Prime Minister told me this story about Gorbachev, and how he was selected because Andropov knew he was different.
So I want to read one paragraph from this wonderful book before we open it up to your questions for a few minutes. And this is really in the concluding chapter of Uncommon Company. And here's what Bill says. There are a number of challenges America faces today that do not involve a foreign enemy. I believe the biggest enemy we face is ourselves. Just as in the Cold War, communication is the key to peace. Let us begin there. Yes, America has let herself become rife with political and social animosities that imperil the magnificent constitutional experiments that make this country what it is. But too often these days we are siloed. We talk to our group and no one else. We listen to our group and no one else. I strongly suggest we address this problem by becoming diplomats. I believe America could more quickly achieve a new stability if it were to adopt the rules of diplomacy in the conduct of its politics. The rules are simple. Listening is better than talking. Asking questions is better than confrontation. Total long-term victory in verbal or actual combat is not possible, nor should it be sought. The best and most durable agreements are those in which all sides believe they have won something. Talking with your adversary is better than warring. Negotiated agreements are not appeasements. Compromise is not a four-letter word. Humor is the great mediator. This was written.
Thank you, Steve.
Written even before the election and more important today. Thank you, Bill.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I want to tell you one story. The quality that we didn't talk about Havel was his incredible sense of humor,
Yeah.
which was everywhere. And I think all of his band of Charter 77 were really held together by humor. And one of the wonderful stories that is told about Vaclav is one time he visited Moscow right after visiting the United States. It must have been in 85. And he went to Moscow directly from his trip to the United States, and he called on that autocrat Putin, and it came time to give gifts, and he said, well, he's thought a lot about the gift he was going to give to Putin, and he said, I've just been to the United States, and I got myself an idea. He said, what is it? He said, I have a peace pipe from an American Indian reservation that was given to me. So I thought I'd give you the peace pipe. Can you imagine the scene of Vaclav Havel giving Putin a peace pipe?
Absolutely. Do we have time to take a couple of questions? We do. All right, and we have microphones. So, yes, in the back.
Sir, what is your take on the Ukrainian situation?
Troubling. I am caught between a sense that the Russians are up to no good there at all, and they've killed a lot of Ukrainians, and that this is a war that the United States can't win. nor can the Ukrainians. So I'm convinced there's a deal that must be made, and I'm also convinced that Putin knows that they can't win this war. And so I guess there has to be some deal made, not a deal a la Trump, where we give up everything, but a deal where the Russians get some of what they want, and NATO gets some of what it wants. And I think there is a deal that is possible. I can't give you the shape of it now, but it's a problem.
Yeah, and I think one of the lessons from your career, Bill, is that peace takes time. Negotiations take time. This is a patient business, not a quick fix business. Yeah. And what we have in the Trump approach is a quick fix approach, and that is very dangerous.
Yeah.
Other question? Yes.
Good evening. My name is Marshall Factor. Sir, how did you find the Metropolitan Museum and being the president? And did you find it anticlimactic to your career as a diplomat? Or was it the climax of your wonderful history of
in a certain
service?
sense, it was the climax of all I'd been prepared for. Anybody who knows the museum knows it's the most politicized environment anywhere. and I found that dealing with the director and the curators was a challenge to me. And
constant negotiations.
yet I think the experience of diplomacy helped me a lot, and I say that in the book.
Or also maybe the other way around, because you introduced culture of the American artists and its predecessors to the Czech Republic. And so I think you were excellent in both fields, but which one did you really prefer in terms of life experiences?
Well, in the case of peace and war, which I care a lot about and worries me a lot, my work as ambassador helped a great deal in preparing me for this. And I guess I'd have to say that you can't solve the issue of peace and war, or even think about it, on Fifth Avenue.
That's good. Let's take one more question. Okay, yes, Michael. See some old friends here.
Hello, you two. This is a wonderful conversation, and thank you for it. It's rare that you see such considered wisdom in the public space, so thank you. Bill, one last question. I was so fond of Vaclav Havel in my brief encounters. You knew him so well. When was the moment that you knew he was the one? Was there a moment when you first met him?
Well, I guess from the very first moment, which was in our embassy, I saw he was talking to Francine Gray, who was visiting as a writer, and he was gathered in the library of our library with a lot of people around him. And all these people were captivated by his presence. And he was a little man, as you know. He was short. And he has a soft voice. And yet all the people around him were just rapt. They were attracted to him compulsively. And I watched that dynamic between him and the Czech people over the years. And I think from the very first moment I realized that he had a charisma that radiates. I remember when Jimmy Carter was president, I used to say when Jimmy Carter would enter a room, all eyes wouldn't turn to Jimmy Carter. I was very fond of him, but he didn't have that radiance, that chemical thing that Havel had. And I think he was the oracle of Prague. He was the oracle of the Cold War. And I must tell you the story. My stories go on, but when Wendy and I were invited to his inauguration, after we gave his inaugural dinner for him, we went to Ladislav Hall, which is this marvelous Gothic building inside the castle, and we saw Václav walking down the red carpet to be sworn in, and he was shuffling along and bent over, as you know how it is. And I said, they can't really expect him to be president of Czechoslovakia. And right after I said that, he got to the end of his walk, and when he stood around to receive the oath, he stood up, and I swear he grew a foot.
Yeah.
In front of my very eyes.
Yeah.
And his voice bellowed out, and he had become the leader that one saw in him, and that all his group recognized was there. He turned out not to be a great president for a whole variety of reasons, but he was certainly
A great man.
more inspiring than others who succeeded communist governments in Central Europe. And he was, as Stephen said, he was a great man.
So, friends, will you join me in thanking Bill for his years of service?
Hey, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. Thank you.